welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Melissa Clark. The federal government is getting closer to finalising a policy shift on asylum seekers. It's looking at the vexed issue on all levels, domestically, regionally and internationally. The United Nations Convention on Refugees is expected to come under the government's scrutiny. Joining me this evening to take a look at the political landscape is Liberal MP Kelly O'Dwyer in Melbourne and Labor MP Steve Georganas, who's in Adelaide. Thanks both for joining us.
Great pleasure.
Well, the government hasn't yet revealed its intentions when it comes to asylum seeker policy, but the hints have already been drawing criticism from the federal opposition leader Tony Abbott.
Mr Rudd's latest suggestion that he will travel the world seeking to change the Refugee Convention is just another distraction from the fact that he can't stop the boats. He started the boats, he can't stop them, and sure, he wants to be in the front of the 747, travelling the world, engaging in meeting after meeting after meeting, talking about the problem, not fixing the problem. The solutions to this problem lie essentially in Australia and on our borders, and I call on Mr Rudd to put them into place.
Tony Abbott there speaking this morning. Well, it certainly has drawn plenty of discussion about the United Nations Refugee Convention. Steve Georganas, is the convention outdated? Does something need to be done to bring it up to contemporary standards?
Well, look, the convention was put together more than 50 years ago for a very different era. And I think it's entirely appropriate to be talking about ensuring that the convention is kept up with our present day times. When the convention was drawn up and modelled back more than 50 years ago, of course it didn't take into account some of the issues that we're facing today. For example, it didn't take into account people smugglers and how they get around the convention and around other issues. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's great to be able to look at the convention, see where it's been, where it's up to, what it's doing, and how it presents itself and how it works effectively in today's world. So I think it's extremely appropriate that we do look at it, and I think things that were in it more than 50 years ago perhaps are very different today in a very different world.
Is it a bit cumbersome though to look at as part of a package to look at dealing with Australia's issue with asylum seekers, given that any kind of change in that area is obviously going to be a long-term project?
Look, no doubt, this is a multifaceted approach. I think the one-line slogans that we hear do not work and are not policies, they're just slogans. What we need is a multifaceted approach. We need a global approach where we work with the UN and world bodies. We need a regional approach where we work with our neighbours, Indonesia, Malaysia, and those around us. And of course we need our national approach as well. One will not work without the other. We had a proposal before the Parliament on 2 occasions now that had that multifaceted approach, and on both occasions the Liberals and the Coalition voted it down, would not support it. Therefore, we are still seeing tragic events today.
It was never actually taken to a vote. It was withdrawn by the government, and people on the Labor side refused to support it. And I think you were actually one of them.
Look, it did go to a vote. It went through the House of Representatives. We had the solution,
Malaysia solution never did.
And it went, oh yes it did, we sat till 5 a.m. in the morning, if you recall. It did go, and it went through the House of Representatives and then was voted down in the Senate. And better check your facts on that one.
Look, I might just bring it back to the international sphere, given certainly that domestic ground is one we've covered quite a lot. Kelly O'Dwyer, what's the Liberals' position on this? Can the United Nations Refugee Convention be updated, or should perhaps Australia look at stepping away from it altogether, given some of our nearest neighbours aren't signatories?
Well, look, this is Kevin Rudd's latest distraction to try and draw attention away from his own policy decisions as Prime Minister in August of 2008. He wants everybody to be talking about, whether or not the convention needs to be updated, rather than actually looking at what action needs to be taken in order to stop the flow of boats to Australia and to stop the deaths at sea, which we have been seeing
not legitimate to look
on a very
at
alarming
that level as well?
Well, indeed he may like to do that, but the point I make is that real action needs to be taken now. And it's very clear what action needs to be taken. Steve is quite right to say that we do need to look at our regional partnerships. We put that in place with the Bali process when we were in government, the Howard government, where we initiated that, but we did that in conjunction with 3 other very important policies: temporary protection visas, offshore processing, and turning back the boats where it was safe to do so. Now, it's very clear what it is that Kevin Rudd needs to do. He needs to stop talking. He actually needs to be prime ministerial. He needs to take action, and he needs to do it today, not sometime off into the never never.
Well, can I put this to you? Wouldn't Australia's situation, indeed the region's situation, be a lot better if our neighbours were to sign on to the convention? Because so it's no longer would they suddenly be transit countries as such, that asylum seekers who reached there would have the opportunity to be accepted into those communities if they were signatories to the Refugee Convention. Perhaps that is a way around this.
Well, look, I would simply say this to you, Melissa. We were able to demonstrate very clearly how it was that we could stop the boats in 2002 when the Howard government made these policy changes. They have been unwound by Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd has not once apologised for having made those changes. We've now seen more than 46,000 people arrive unauthorised by boat. We've seen more than 1,000 people drown at sea. We see now more than 1,800 children in detention. In the last year of the Howard government, only 4 people arrived unauthorised by boat, and there were no children in detention. So you can't say to me that we can't actually solve this problem. We did at a time where there were 20% more people seeking asylum throughout the world than there are today.
And one of the initiatives of the coalition was to wind back the official appeals processes, in particular the Refugee Review Tribunal, which is something Labor had put back in place since coming into government. Steve Georgianis, would that be an area the federal government, if Labor were to stay in power after the election, be willing to perhaps tighten up or perhaps even go as far as the Howard government did in removing that Refugees Review Tribunal process?
Look, what I can say is that it's a very complex area and all facets of it should be looked at. As I said, it needs to be a multifaceted approach. We need to be doing all that we can to ensure that we prevent further drownings at sea, that we prevent people from getting on rickety boats and paying thousands of dollars to people smugglers. And as I said earlier, we need to look at all the possible solutions to this. And it won't be solved with a simple one-line slogan, as we hear from the opposition, which is turn the boats back. We need to get a global perspective, a regional perspective and a national perspective. And we need to fix it for the long term, not short-term fixes. So I think when we're talking about this issue, you look at all aspects of it and ensure that we put the right measures in place. We had some of those measures which were referred to us by the Houston report, yet the opposition would not support it. Now that would have gone a long way in ensuring that some prevention was there, and would have gone a long way to preventing further people from mishaps on the high seas.
Okay, just before we move on from this topic, I just finally want to ask Kelly O'Dwyer about the coalition's position when it comes to the Refugee Review Tribunal. We've seen a coalition government remove that process before. Would you be willing to do it again?
Well, first I must pick up, Steve, on the comment he just made in relation to the Houston report, because of course the government didn't seek to implement all of the recommendations, so that is not correct to say that.
That's because you wouldn't let us. You wouldn't allow us to implement it.
Well, you didn't bring forward any legislation. I mean, this is the other misnomer, and I say it again to you. I mean, you need to check the facts on that.
I do just want to quickly get back to that point on the Refugee Review Tribunal, and then we want to move on.
We've detailed our policy, and it's not a one-word slogan or a one-sentence slogan or whatever phrase they'd like to put on it. The government has not articulated what it will do and how long it will take. I mean, Steve, there are 2 basic questions. You can answer it today, and if it's simply more talking to our neighbours and you know, navel gazing, then you'll simply not get anything done.
All right, well, I do want to move on to the other big issue that we've seen this week, which is, of course, there's the government's changes to the processing of fringe benefits tax, particularly when it comes to cars that are done through novated leases. It certainly proved to be a controversial move and something that's become quite a bit of political fodder between the Treasurer and the Shadow Treasurer, as we've seen play out again today. Let's hear from both the Treasurer and the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen and Joe Hockey.
If you're getting a car for 100% or almost exclusively personal use, you should be treated the same if you're a battler who goes down to buy a second-hand car in Parramatta as if you buy it through a novated lease. And that means you don't get the sort of tax break that you might otherwise like.
There has been absolutely no proof of these so-called tax rorts from the government. Not only have they failed to consult the industry, but the people that are going to be hit the hardest are everyday Australians driving Holdens, Toyotas and Fords.
Aside from the impacts of this decision, Steve Georganas, I want to ask you one specific question. Kevin Rudd had said he was a changed man, that he'd learnt to consult more widely. If that's the case, why wasn't more consultation done with business on this before it was announced?
Oh, look, there's no doubt that there is consultation taking place. I know that Mr Carr is speaking with the industry today as we're talking, and talks will continue to see a way working through this with the automotive industry. But can I say that this decision was taken because we made a decision to scrap the carbon tax and go to an ETS. To do that, we had to tighten the fringe benefits tax. Now, what this is saying is that if you're entitled to a fringe benefits tax for your motor vehicle, that you keep a logbook for 12 weeks out of 5 years. So it's just adhering to the legitimate law, to the legitimate tax laws. If you're entitled to a fringe benefits tax, you'll continue to be entitled to it.
But clearly, just before we get to you, Kelly, clearly the industry sees this as being a significant problem, because this morning we've had a Melbourne-based car leasing company that deals with salary sacrifice in this area come out and say they're going to have to sack half their workforce because of these changes. I just want to hear briefly from the managing director of that company, Matt Reiner.
This morning crying with my wife saying, well, hold on Monday I had a viable business. I don't have a viable business today. The 50% staff that we are going to unfortunately have to tell that they no longer have a job, I'm not quite sure that's the end of it either.
So, Steve Georganas, shouldn't that have discussions that are being had with industry now been had before we got to this point?
Look, as I said, I know that Minister Carr is having discussions, and I'd be hoping he'd be having discussions with that particular firm as well. Can I just reiterate that if you are legitimately claiming for a fringe benefits tax, you'll continue to do so. Nothing changes. So I can't see this is good law. This is a good move by the government. It doesn't change anything for those who are legitimately claiming and have every right to claim for a work vehicle through a fringe benefits tax. The only danger to the automotive industry is the $500 million that Tony Abbott said he'll cut from the assistance. That would said automotive companies broke.
I will interrupt you there because I did interrupt Kelly O'Dwyer before when she was trying to speak. Kelly, the Coalition's position here?
Well, I simply have to say, you know, this is Kevin Rudd Mark 1, not Mark 2. This is more of the old Kevin that we've come to know. It's policy by thought bubble. Kevin Rudd decided to do it, and he didn't consult with anybody other than his departments, didn't consult with any stakeholders or industry or manufacturers, people who will ultimately have their businesses really hurt, and people who will ultimately have to sack workers, as we've just heard now. And he did that, and unfortunately we've seen the consequence of it. This is also at a time where they actually did, only 2 years ago, change these very laws.
All right,
in 2011.
I will have to interrupt you again, I'm afraid, because we're running out of time. Kelly O'Dwyer in Melbourne, thank you, and Steve Georganas in Adelaide, thank you for joining us too. We'll be back the same time tomorrow night with more on Capitol Hill. Good evening.